Learn about the Danish terms in an ancestry chart. In an ancestry chart, you will find the names of many of your ancestors. All of these ancestors has, as it is known, an alias. It could, for example, be the alias of your mother's mother, grandmother. In Danish there is, however, a difference between the Danish aliases for ancestors compared to the aliases in Danish. Now, there will be enumerated some of the most simple aliases that do not have much variation compared to the English aliases. Subsequently, there will be given a few details about the aliases of the unequal kind. These will then be enumerated too. Let us start. The simple aliases. These do not have any specific variations. English, mother. In Danish we call it mor. Father. In Danish we call it far. Sister. In Danish we call it Søster. Brother. In Danish we call it Bror. Son. In Danish we call it søn. Daughter. In Danish we call it Datter. Onkel. In Danish we call it Onkel. Stepmother. In Danish we call it Stedmor. Stepfather. In Danish we call it Stedfar. Stepbrother. In Danish we call it Stedbror. Stepsister. In Danish we call it Stedsøster. Stepson. In Danish we call it Stedson. Stepdaughter. In Danish we call it Steddatter. Nephew. In Danish it is called Neve. Half-sister. In Danish we call it Halvsøster. Half-brother. In Danish we call it Halvbror. Great-grandfather. In Danish we call it Oldefar. Great-grandmother. In Danish we call it oldemor. Great-great-grandmother. In Danish we call it Tip-tip-oldemor. Great-great-grandfather. In Danish we call it Tip-oldefar. Great-great-great-grandmother. In Danish we call it Tip-tip-oldemor. Great-great-great-grandfather. In Danish we call it Tip-tip-oldefar. Great-great-great-great-grandmother. In Danish we call it Tip-tip-tip-oldemor. Great-great-great-great-grandfather. In Danish we call it Tip-tip-tip-oldefar. Niece. In Danish we call it niece. In Danish we have some specific aliases for each of the grandparents compared to the English aliases for those. However, it is not abnormal to call grandfather or grandmother Stedfar or Bedstemor. Now we continue. The different aliases. These do have variations. A mother's mother. In Danish we call it Mormor. Mother's father. In Danish we call that Morfar. Father's mother. In Danish we call it Farmor. Father's father. In Danish we call that Farfar. In English we have one alias for the cousin. In Danish, nevertheless, we distinguish between a male cousin and a female cousin. That means each cousin has its very own alias in Danish. A male cousin. In Danish we call it Fætter. A female cousin. In Danish we call it Kusine. The rules about the Danish aliases for cousins applies to the alias naming of a mother's sister or father's sister too, in English also known as aunt. A mother's sister. In Danish we call it moster. A father's sister. In Danish we call it Tante. In Danish we have aliases for some of the distant ancestors too, for example a distant cousin. A male distant cousin. In Danish we call it Grandfætter. A female distant cousin. In Danish we call it Grandkusine. Grand aunt. In Danish we call it grandmoster or grandtante.